A white manager tried to intimidate a black teen mid-flight, but within the hour, they were landing straight in court. A white manager struck a black teen Midair with a pair of handcuffs. Thinking the cabin would stay silent, he didn't realize they would be landing straight into a courtroom before the hour was over. The moment metal hit skin, the entire flight became evidence. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when real justice steps forward. Cale's shoulder brushed Benton Core's arm the moment he stood to stretch, and the reaction was instant, sharp enough to slice through the quiet hum of the cabin. Benton's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing as though the boy had committed something far greater than a simple bump. Cale blinked, startled, murmuring, "Sorry, sir," while adjusting his balance against the seat back. His voice was soft, respectful, carrying the nervous excitement of a teenager preparing for something important. But Benton didn't respond. He simply stared, too long, too cold, before turning away with a stiff breath through his nose. The moment lingered like an unfinished sentence, hanging heavy between the rows. Jamal Redden watched the exchange from his seat, his gaze steady but unreadable. He had seen countless small frictions on flights before, but something in Benton's expression unsettled him. Benton's jaw twitched, a pulse jumping beneath his cheek, as if containing irritation he refused to voice. Jamal placed a calm hand on Cale's arm as the boy sat down again. "You all right?" he asked quietly, his tone threaded with warmth and fatherly caution. Cale nodded, though his eyes drifted for a moment toward the aisle, where Benton now sat rigidly, arms crossed, studying the cabin with the intensity of a man searching for something to scold. The plane's overhead lights glowed in a soft white wash, illuminating the rows in a uniform calm that contrasted sharply with the tension Benton emanated. Passengers whispered to one another, some glancing up from their screens and books when they sensed a disruption. The aircraft had barely begun its taxi, yet the cabin air already felt thicker than it should. Cale tried to refocus, lifting the tablet that held his slides. His hands trembled slightly, though he attempted to hide it with a quick smile toward his father. "I just want tomorrow to go right," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Jamal smiled, the tired but proud smile of a single father who understood every weight his son carried. "It will," he replied gently. "You've prepared for this." But Bennett wasn't finished watching them. He leaned slightly forward, pretending to examine a flight display across the aisle, though his eyes kept flicking toward Cale. There was something measured in the way he observed them, something too controlled to be casual curiosity. Jamal noticed it again, this time more clearly. The pattern wasn't random. Benton wasn't glancing at everyone. He was watching them. Outside the windows, the runway lights stretched into orderly lines as the plane joined the departure queue. Engines rumbled with a rising pitch, vibrating through the floor and into the passengers' feet. Yet inside Jamal's row, the atmosphere felt frozen, as though the earlier bump had cracked open a door that should have stayed shut. When the aircraft lifted off, Cale pressed back into his seat, taking a deep breath as Velcrest shrank beneath him. Jamal watched him quietly, noting how the boy tried to shake off the earlier tension. But Benton's presence loomed like a shadow across the aisle. The man shifted positions constantly, glancing at them with subtle movements that only someone as attentive as Jamal would catch. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was there, persistent, sharp, and growing. Cale resumed, adjusting his tie, repeating the first line of his presentation under his breath. His voice, fragile with anticipation, carried a hope that made the moment feel even more delicate. This trip wasn't just a flight. It was a milestone, a step into the future. And that was precisely why Benton's behavior struck Jamal as more than irritation. It felt like the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. Benton shifted again, resting one elbow on the armrest and staring toward the aisle with a blank expression that masked something far heavier beneath it. His fingers tapped in a slow, a rhythmic pattern, and the slight tremor in his jaw returned. Jamal recognized that tension. He had seen it in engineering rooms when professionals reached breaking points, when frustration simmered into reckless decision-making. The difference here was that Benton wasn't dealing with machinery. He was dealing with people, with a boy. The silence between them thickened as the plane climbed. Dramatic irony pressed against Jamal's understanding. The sense that something was forming in the space around them, a threat not yet declared but already shaping itself. Cale leaned toward his father. "Do you think he's upset?" he whispered. "I think," Jamal replied, keeping his tone calm but firm, "that some people carry storms before they speak them." Across the aisle, Benton's eyes flicked up once more, full of a tension that didn't belong on a routine flight. Foreshadowing clung to Benton like static in the pressurized cabin. The sky wasn't the only thing ready to break. The strike came without warning, sharp, metallic, and slicing through the hum of the cabin like a blade through cloth. Cale's head jerked sideways, his cheek instantly blossoming with a thin red line as the cold steel edge of the handcuffs dragged across his skin. For a heartbeat, the aircraft froze. Every passenger, every breath, every flicker of overhead light seemed suspended in midair, as if even the plane itself recoiled in disbelief. Cale's hand shot to his face, his fingers trembling as they brushed the warm smear of blood. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in confusion, a stunned attempt to understand what had just happened. He had been rehearsing a single sentence, a harmless, whispered line, then pain. Jamal rose so quickly that his seatbelt slid from his lap and coiled to the floor. His breath caught in his throat, not from panic but from the violent shock of seeing his son hurt. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, he stood completely still. His hands hung open at his sides, stiff and shaking, as if the body was trying to move faster than the mind could follow. Benton Core remained crouched beside Cale's seat, the handcuffs dangling loosely from his grip. The expression on his face was unnervingly calm, like someone who believed he had acted within his rights. But the tight quiver along his jaw betrayed something else, pride mixed with spite. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs beginning to rise among passengers. "I told him this isn't a playground," Benton said, each word clipped with a rising irritation that had been simmering since takeoff. His posture remained tense, his shoulders rigid, as though bracing for an argument he had already decided he would win. Jamal's voice came out steady, though his pulse hammered beneath the surface. "My son did nothing wrong." His tone carried no anger, only control so precise it bordered on cold fire. He stepped closer, placing himself between Benton and Cale, his body angled protectively. Even then, Cale's eyes stayed fixed on him, silently asking if he was supposed to be afraid. From 3 rows back, a rustle broke the silence. A man in a blue coat, seated alone by the window, lifted his phone in a subtle, practiced motion. His thumb slid across the screen, and the camera lens glinted faintly under the cabin lights. He didn't speak. He didn't lean forward. He simply began to record, his gaze steady, his posture neutral, a quiet witness gathering truth before it could be buried beneath excuses. Benton noticed. His eyes flicked toward the passenger, then back to Jamal and Cale. Something tightened in his expression, a defensive instinct twisting into something darker. He pulled his ID badge from his jacket and held it up, his voice rising a notch. "I'm authorized to intervene. Disruptive behavior is a safety risk." "Rehearsing a presentation isn't disruptive," Jamal replied, forcing his breathing to slow. He needed clarity now, not fury. He scanned Cale quickly, noting the blood, the trembling hands, the shock in his breathing. His son was hurt, truly hurt, and the realization stabbed through him with enough force to steady every instinct he had. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. A teenager whispered to his father. A business traveler leaned forward with narrowed eyes. A flight attendant at the far end of the aisle hesitated, her hand hovering near the intercom as she tried to process what she had just seen. Benton's grip on the handcuffs tightened. "I said he needed to show respect." "Respect," Jamal repeated quietly, his brows lowering. "You struck a child." The tension in the aisle grew thick, almost visible, like a pressure drop in the air before a storm breaks. Dramatic irony curled beneath the moment. None of the passengers knew why Benton carried such authority, but they knew enough. It was an authority he had no right to use like this. Cale sucked in a shaky breath. The sound was small, barely audible, but it sliced through Jamal's composure. He stepped further forward, shielding his son completely. The front of the cabin seemed to narrow, pulling everyone's focus inward, locking them into a single shared moment of disbelief. A scream rose from the back of the aisle as someone finally reacted to the blood running down Cale's face. The flight attendant gasped and grabbed the intercom, her other hand covering her mouth. The plane felt smaller now, tighter, as if the steel frame itself was reacting to the tension spiraling through the cabin. Jamal straightened, drawing in a controlled breath. "You are going to step back," he said quietly, his voice low and unshakable. "Right now." But Benton did not move. He knelt there still, handcuffs in hand, authority in his posture, defiance burning beneath his calm expression. His pride had been struck harder than Cale's cheek, and it showed in every taut line of his body. The passengers began whispering. Some lifted phones, some clutched armrests. All of them waited. And in that suspended silence, with Jamal standing firm, Cale gripping his cheek, the passengers holding their breath, and Benton refusing to back down, the entire cabin seemed to shift. The plane, once silent, had turned into a pressurized courtroom in the clouds. And the gavel had just come down. Chaos erupted the instant the metal edge of the handcuffs struck Cale's cheek. Passengers gasped, some rising halfway from their seats before instinct forced them back down. The narrow aisle trembled with startled motion, but Jamal's voice sliced through it all before panic could fully bloom. "Everyone stay in your seats. I want every phone recording. This is a legal incident now." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The steadiness in his tone carried more force than shouting ever could. It was the voice of a man who had spent years solving crises with logic rather than fear. His calm was intense, sharper than anger, and it froze the cabin just long enough for order to take shape again. Cale sat stiffly, his head bowed slightly as if stunned by the sound more than the pain. A thin ribbon of blood slid down his cheek, catching on the curve of his jaw before dropping onto the safety card tucked in the seat pocket. His eyes trembled with shock, not yet with fear. He lifted one hand slowly, almost in disbelief, touching the warm line of blood as though trying to understand what had just happened. Across from him, Benton core straightened, his breath uneven and defensive. "He was interfering with crew operations," he blurted, voice shaking with a mixture of indignation and fear. His fingers tightened around the cuffs, knuckles pale. His chest rose sharply, as if expecting agreement from the rows of silent onlookers. But no one supported him. The air itself seemed to lean away from him. Two men rose from their seats, three rows back. The first, a medical intern with a calm but urgent stance, stepped into the aisle and raised his hands to show he meant no threat. The second, a legal assistant with neatly combed dark hair, followed close behind. The intern knelt beside Cale without hesitation. "I am trained. Let me take a look," he said gently, studying the cut with professional focus. His eyes stayed steady, but the tension in his jaw showed his anger at what he had witnessed. The legal assistant positioned himself between Benton and the boy, not confrontational, but firm. "I saw everything," he said, "and I'm prepared to testify." Passengers shifted in their seats, adjusting angles, raising cameras. Red recording lights blinked across the cabin like tiny signals of truth finally being allowed to speak. The flight attendant at the front dialed the cockpit, her hands trembling. Moments later, the captain emerged, his uniform crisp but his expression strained. He froze mid-step when he saw Benton. Something in the captain's eyes flickered, recognition, caution, maybe even regret. For a single second, the two men exchanged a silent, weighted glance, one that suggested history neither wished to discuss here. Jamal noticed instantly. His mind, trained to spot patterns and deviations, locked onto the tension between the two men. "There's more to this," he murmured under his breath, leaning closer to Cale. He placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, steadying him. In a low whisper only Cale could hear, he said, "We stay calm, but we don't let this vanish." Cale nodded faintly, his breath thin but controlled. He held onto his father's hand like an anchor. Benton stepped forward again, desperate to reclaim authority he no longer held. "He needs to be restrained," he insisted, voice cracking. He interfered. "That's protocol." His hand hovered over the cuffs, as if the object itself justified his actions. But the tremble in his wrist betrayed him. The captain hesitated, his eyes darting between Benton and the wounded teen. Sweat gathered at his temple despite the cool air circulating through the vents. Passengers watched him with a collective expectation, waiting to see whether he would stand on the side of truth or remain aligned with whatever secrets seemed to bind him to the aggressive manager. Before the captain could speak, the medical intern rose with calm authority. He pulled out his ID, extending it toward both men. "The only restraint you'll see is legal," he said. His voice was unwavering, almost cold in its certainty. "The boy is injured. He requires care, not punishment." Whispers moved through the cabin in soft waves. The legal assistant stepped beside him, holding his phone high, its camera still recording. "Everything you do or refuse to do is being documented," he warned. Benton's face tightened, the muscles beneath his skin twitching like wires pulled too thin. But he said nothing. For the first time, uncertainty overtook his anger. The captain took a slow breath, as if weighing every possible outcome. He straightened his posture, but the uncertainty remained in his eyes. Jamal watched him carefully, sensing that the man was not simply indecisive. He was conflicted, torn between duty and something hidden, something that made him falter at every decision. In that moment, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted again. It was no longer chaos. It was no longer noise. It was anticipation, the collective waiting of dozens of strangers holding their breath. The aircraft hummed steadily beneath their feet, but the tension in the air rose faster than the altitude ever could. And though no one spoke it aloud, every passenger could feel it. Something bigger was unfolding, something bent asterisk toward truth whether the crew liked it or not. Foreshadowing pulsed beneath every breath. Truth was rising faster than the altitude. The moment the captain ordered Benton to sit down, the cabin shifted into a heavy stillness, as if the air itself understood the stakes. Benton hesitated, his shoulders rigid, his eyes burning with refusal, but the captain's firm gesture forced him back into the crew row. The tension between them crackled, hinting at an unspoken history that the passengers could sense but not name. Jamal remained standing, one hand lightly resting on the back of Cale's seat, the other curled at his side with a controlled precision that made it clear he was balancing fear, anger, and responsibility all at once. "I'm requesting immediate diversion," Jamal said, his voice low but steady. It carried not just authority, but a father's urgency. "My son has been assaulted, Midair. This aircraft is no longer operating under safe or lawful conditions." The captain stiffened. He was a tall man with a clipped tone and a stare that rarely wavered. But at that moment, his gaze flickered toward Benton, as if seeking permission rather than offering command. "We cannot divert," he replied after a breath, his tone coated with caution. "There's turbulence ahead and tight arrival scheduling. Landing early is not feasible." A murmur passed through the passengers, soft but sharp, like a gust of doubt winding through the aisles. Cale, still shaken, looked up at his father with wide, searching eyes. Jamal inhaled slowly, steadying himself as if anchoring his emotions before speaking again. "Captain," he said, "this is not a request based on convenience. This is a safety breach." Benton let out a bitter laugh. "You're exaggerating," he muttered, leaning back with crossed arms, though his fingers twitched restlessly. "The boy was disrespectful. I intervened." Jamal turned his head just enough to meet Benton's eyes, not with hostility, but with an expression that warned of consequences. "He stood," Jamal replied, "and you struck him. That is not intervention." The passengers watched, some leaning forward, others clutching their armrests. aware that every word seemed to tighten the invisible rope pulling the cabin toward conflict. The flight attendant hovered near the galley, torn between protocol and the instinct to flee from responsibility she knew was beyond her scope. Without another word, Jamal reached down and unlatched his briefcase. The metallic click echoed louder than it should have. He opened the case with deliberate calm and removed a small, engraved badge. The gold sheen reflected the cabin lights, drawing every eye toward it. The captain's eyebrows lifted. Benton's smirk evaporated. Jamal held the badge firmly, letting its weight anchor him. "I am a certified federal engineering officer under the Aviation Integrity Panel," he announced, his voice clear enough for the entire front half of the plane to hear. The passengers fell silent, absorbing the meaning of his words. Even Cale's breathing slowed, caught between confusion and awe. "I have the authority to override flight decisions when safety violations occur." The captain's face paled slightly. His lips parted, but no words emerged at first. A crew member at the front seemed to recognize the badge instantly. His head dipped in a slow, reluctant nod, confirming that Jamal's authority was legitimate and strong enough to reshape the fate of the flight. Jamal continued, "Under Clause 7.3, I am overriding flight authority for emergency intervention due to unlawful Midair assault." His tone was not loud, but the certainty within it held far more force than volume ever could. The cabin gasped softly, a unified intake of disbelief and relief mingled together. The captain swallowed and glanced once more toward Benton, as though hoping for guidance or escape. But Benton could offer neither. His jaw tightened, and his breathing turned shallow. The captain gave a stiff nod, choosing compliance over conflict. "Very well," he muttered, stepping toward the intercom with a mechanical stiffness. His thumb hovered over the button for a moment, hesitation flickering like a brief shadow. Then he pressed it. His voice, now carefully controlled, echoed through the cabin. "Attention! We are diverting to Harvenport Field for medical and legal response." A mixture of shock and vindication washed over the passengers. Someone whispered, "He did it." Another exhaled shakily, as if releasing tension they had been holding since the assault. That was when Benton surged to his feet, his face contorted with anger. "You can't do this," he spat, taking a step toward Jamal with a trembling hand raised in frustration. Jamal stepped forward calmly, placing himself between Benton and the rest of the cabin, his expression unchanging. His voice, quiet but resolute, cut through the air like a clean blade. "You already did." The word struck harder than any physical blow, leaving Benton momentarily speechless. The plane hummed with the soft vibration of descent preparing to begin, yet the atmosphere felt far from steady. It felt like justice was shifting, like gravity itself was changing course to support it. And as the aircraft gently began its turn toward Harvenport, every passenger felt the symbolic weight of the moment settling into their memories. And now, the ground was rising to meet them. The descent into Harvenport Field began with a jolt that rippled through the cabin like a silent warning. Benton Core fumed in his seat, shoulders tight, jaw rigid, breathing in short, sharp bursts. The polished metal of his handcuffs rested against his belt, gleaming with bitter irony under the dimmed cabin lights. Every time the plane tilted, the cuffs clinked softly, a taunting reminder of the violence he had unleashed minutes earlier. Cale sat beside Jamal with a firm bandage pressed against his cheek, the medical intern's careful hands having cleaned the wound with calm precision. Though Cale's face carried the sting of the assault, his eyes were alert, searching, refusing to be swallowed by fear. The cabin remained locked as the wheels touched the ground with a heavy, dragging thud. The landing gear groaned under the weight of urgency. A tense silence stretched across all rows as passengers exchanged uncertain glances, their knuckles tight around armrests and devices. Jamal checked his watch with controlled composure. It had been less than 48 minutes since Benton raised those cuffs. The speed of everything, violence, intervention, authority, felt unreal, yet Jamal stayed focused. He needed to protect Cale, and he needed the truth to be acknowledged. A crackle sounded over the intercom, and every head lifted. All passengers remained seated, the flight attendant announced, his voice steadier than his trembling hands. Federal Tribunal representatives will board the plane momentarily. The tension thickened. Even the air seemed to slow. Benton stiffened in his seat, glancing toward the aisle as though searching for an escape that did not exist. The cabin door opened with a firm hiss. 3 men stepped in, 2 plainclothes tribunal officers and 1 legal monitor. Their expressions were calm, but their purpose radiated through the narrow aisle. As they walked, passengers pulled their phones closer, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. The lead officer stopped directly in front of Benton. "Benton Core," he said, voice steady. "You're being detained pending inquiry for unlawful force, racial misconduct, and mid-flight endangerment." Benton stood slowly, trying to keep his posture rigid. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, his chest rising with restrained agitation. But he did not resist, not with every camera locked onto him, not with 2 officers ready to intervene if he twitched the wrong way. One of the officers turned his attention to Jamal. His tone shifted, becoming both respectful and precise. "We're going to process the hearing right here in the aircraft," he said, meeting Jamal's steady gaze. Around them, passengers murmured, unsure if they were witnessing history or danger, or both. Jamal placed a steady hand on Cale's shoulder, grounding him, while the boy watched the tribunal officers with a mix of curiosity and quiet resolve. As the officers began setting up a temporary area at the front of the cabin, a silent understanding passed through the passengers. This wasn't just an investigation. It was an immediate reckoning. Every vibration of the aircraft floor, every echo of movement, every clipped instruction from the officers carried the weight of accountability. The legal monitor unfolded a compact tablet, tapping through protocol screens with swift efficiency. One officer began interviewing witnesses row by row. Another took brief custody of Benton, positioning him in a seat at the plane's rear, away from the passengers he had endangered. Throughout it all, the engines hummed and idle, a low, vibrating reminder that the aircraft had become something new, no longer a vessel of travel, but a vessel of justice. Jamal breathed in deeply. He could feel the shift happening around him, something larger than the incident itself. The tribunal's presence meant no evasions, no delays, no quiet settlements. It meant truth preserved at the altitude where it happened. Passengers leaned forward slightly, watching with quiet awe as the officers prepared the space. A legal proceeding on a plane, moments after landing, was something none of them had expected to witness. But the swiftness felt right. It felt necessary. One officer glanced toward Jamal again, nodding respectfully as they finalized the setup. "This won't take long," he assured, his voice carrying both professionalism and an undercurrent of determination. Jamal nodded back, steady, centered. Cale held onto the armrest, watching every movement, every word exchanged. He wasn't only witnessing justice, he was part of it. A hush fell over the cabin as preparations reached completion. The officers exchanged final signals with one another. Benton sat rigidly, breathing through clenched teeth. Cale's heartbeat slowed as he leaned slightly into his father. Jamal straightened, ready. A mobile courtroom was about to begin. Justice didn't wait to land anymore. The tribunal desk snapped open with a metallic click, the sound cutting through the thick, humming silence of the cabin. Passengers leaned forward instinctively, their eyes fixed on the sudden transformation of the first-class section into a courtroom at 38,000 feet. The temporary barrier rose into place, sealing off a narrow aisle where authority and fear now stood face to face. Officer Marincale and legal monitor Darren Voss stepped into view, jackets crisp, eyes sharp, movements precise. Their presence alone settled the chaos into a tense, watchful stillness. Benton Core, stiff and unblinking, sat with his hands clasped too tightly in his lap, the faint tremble in his knuckles betraying the calm mask he tried to hold. Jamal moved into the partition space when summoned, steady and deliberate, Cale sitting just behind him with a bandage running along his cheek. The boy's breathing was shallow, but his eyes stayed wide, alert, trying to understand how a moment of excitement had turned into a crisis that now involved federal officers. The low rumble of the plane underscored every heartbeat, making the tribunal feel even more surreal. Justice unfolding in a place meant for quiet travel. Dr. Redden, Officer Marin Cale said, voice measured, please recount the events as they happened. Jamal inhaled, grounding himself before speaking. Benton approached my son without provocation. He said, his tone clear and calm. Cale was seated, quiet, and preparing for a presentation. There was no disorder, no conflict. Benton presented a restraint device and struck him with it. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. Passengers nearby nodded subtly, their earlier shock turning into silent support. Voss lifted a handheld device. We request any video submissions. His expression remained unreadable, but the lines near his eyes suggested he already expected the truth to be undeniable. Phones lit up across the cabin. Within moments, 3 files appeared in the tribunal's shared feed. Voss tapped the screen, and the first recording filled the small display. Benton's face, captured from just a few feet away, flickered to life. The slow, chilling moment when he raised the cuff and struck Cale played out frame by frame, the metallic edge catching the cabin light before impact. A few passengers gasped softly, not because they hadn't seen it before, but because replaying it forced them to relive the disbelief and fear. Benton's expression hardened as the footage looped. He kept his eyes on the faint reflection in the window rather than the screen, choosing not to watch himself commit the act. But the slight twitch in his left cheek gave away more truth than any confession could. The second angle showed him from behind, making the strike appear even more premeditated, his arm rising with rigid intention. The third video captured Cale's immediate recoil and the stunned silence that had followed. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Jamal didn't look at Benton. He looked at his son. Then he spoke again. He struck my son while he was seated, quiet, and compliant. I want every passenger here to remember what that says about power. His voice carried no anger, only gravity and conviction. And somehow, that calmness made the truth even sharper. Cale shifted slightly, whispering, I just wanted to give a speech tomorrow. His voice was small, but the weight of it settled over every row. The boy wasn't thinking about tribunals or legal rulings. He had only wanted his moment to share ideas, not to be struck for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Officer Cale and Voss exchanged a look, subtle but meaningful. A silent exchange that suggested there was more at stake than a single incident. There was something systemic here, something deeper than the handcuff that had opened the wound on Cale's cheek. The tribunal officers could feel the currents shifting, the kind of shift that often hinted at revelations still waiting to surface. Voss stepped forward, adjusting the tablet in his hands. His voice resonated through the makeshift courtroom, composed but carrying the authority of the law. Due to overwhelming visual and testimonial evidence, he announced, an immediate ruling will be processed in flight under Article 9, 8.2. The passengers didn't cheer. They didn't whisper. They simply watched, understanding that they were part of something they would one day retell, an extraordinary moment where truth refused to wait for landing. Benton finally looked up, but it was too late. His control had slipped the moment the first recording played. Outside the thin walls of the plane, the clouds drifted by, indifferent witnesses to a conflict that was shifting the very air inside. Justice wasn't approaching, it was already here, unfolding in real time between rows of seats and flickering lights. A verdict at 38,000 feet. The sky had never held justice this close before. The moment the recording clicked to a stop, the cabin fell into a silence, so sharp it felt like the air itself had frozen. Legal monitor Darren Voss did not wait for the tension to settle. He stepped forward with the steadiness of someone who had delivered verdicts at high altitude before, his expression carved with authority. Benton Core, he announced, his voice carrying through the aisle like the opening line of a judgment. This tribunal finds you in violation of Midair restraint protocols, misuse of force, and racial profiling under the inter-cabin equity mandate. His tone didn't waver, each word falling with a controlled precision that made even the engine sound quieter. Benton's eyes flicked sharply, a quick flash of disbelief that hardened into anger. He rose halfway from his seat, hands trembling as if caught between outrage and fear. "This isn't a court," he snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of the attention suddenly fixed on him. The outburst carried a desperate edge, one that suggested he had expected consequences, but not this openly, not this decisively. Voss didn't flinch. His posture remained upright, his voice calm yet firm. "You are mistaken," he replied, meeting Benton's stare with unshakable resolve. "This is exactly a court when the altitude qualifies under Article 9. His words lingered in the air, almost echoing against the cabin walls, as if the very aircraft acknowledged its transformation into a judicial chamber. From row 10, a lone passenger in a gray jacket slapped his palms together once, breaking the stillness. The sound rippled through the cabin, and within a second, another clap followed. A brief, spontaneous applause rose, not loud, not celebratory, but filled with gratitude that someone had spoken truth into a moment that felt unreal. Voss raised a hand, gently motioning for quiet. The applause faded, but its effect remained. The passengers were no longer terrified bystanders. They were witnesses. Cale, still resting against Jamal's shoulder, exhaled softly. The boy hadn't spoken, but his posture spoke volumes. His head leaned into his father's chest, his breathing slow, steadying, as if trying to anchor himself in a moment that kept shifting beneath his feet. Jamal placed a reassuring hand on his son's back, his expression steady but intense. He said nothing, yet his silence felt like a promise that he was present, alert, and unwilling to let anything pass without challenge. Just when the atmosphere seemed to settle, Voss motioned to the second officer, Marin Cale. "Bring him forward," Voss said. Heads turned as the captain, who until then had observed the proceedings from a distance, was summoned. His walk down the aisle was hesitant, shoulders tense, eyes darting from passenger to passenger, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. He stopped at the tribunal desk, swallowing hard. Without a word, Officer Marin Cale tapped a command on the portable console. A second recording began to play, not video this time, but audio captured through the aircraft's intercom system. The voice was unmistakable. The cabin speakers carried the captain's earlier whisper, laced with impatience and indifference. "If Benton wants to shut the boy up, let him." A collective breath left the passengers. A few gasped. One man covered his mouth. The betrayal was clear, laid bare by his own voice. The captain stiffened, his face draining of color, shoulders sagging as if the weight of his own words had finally crashed down upon him. Jamal's eyes narrowed. He didn't speak, didn't shift, but something in him sharpened, an internal recognition that the hostility toward his son had not been a spontaneous outburst from a single man. It was part of something layered, something that had been allowed to exist unchecked. He felt Cale's fingers grip the fabric of his sleeve, not in fear, but to steady himself. Voss paused the recording, allowing the cabin to absorb the truth. "Captain Rellin," he said, turning slowly toward the trembling man, "your compliance in permitting misconduct has broadened the tribunal's scope. You knowingly allowed a violation of passenger safety." The captain opened his mouth as if to protest, but no sound emerged. Even the dim cabin lights seemed to glare down at him. Passengers murmured in low, tense whispers. A man in row 4 shook his head in disbelief. Another leaned forward, eyes narrowed, as if replaying every moment of the flight through a new lens. Everything had shifted. The tribunal was no longer about a single assault. It was about complicity. Jamal remained still, his expression unreadable, but his mind was moving fast and precise. The pieces, the delay in intervention, the resistance to divert, the guarded glances began aligning into a pattern he could no longer ignore. The aircraft around them felt smaller now, the aisle narrower, the lights dimmer. Everyone seemed pulled toward the tribunal desk, as if the cabin itself had become an arena where truth could no longer hide. The captain lowered his head. Voss straightened, closing the console with a quiet click. His gaze swept across the passengers, then back to the accused individuals. The moment held, tense and charged, before finally settling into a chilling clarity. The tribunal's scope had just doubled. The sky wasn't just a witness, it was now the jury too. The manager smirked, convinced the altitude would protect him, unaware that every witness, every recording, and every policy violation had already turned against him. The teen's father calmly gathered the evidence, preparing to flip the entire airline the moment wheels touched ground. If you believe cruelty under authority always folds when strategy meets truth, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The captain's authority was stripped so quickly that the cabin felt the shift in power as sharply as a sudden drop in altitude. One moment he stood at the front, chin raised in forced composure. The next, tribunal officer Marin Kale scanned his credentials with a cold, metallic beep that echoed through the narrow aisle. The captain's face tightened, his jaw trembling as the digital tablet displayed a red banner. Authority revoked pending tribunal recall. Passengers watched with wide, uncertain eyes, their breaths caught, as though fearing a vibrational tremor might shatter the fragile order being rebuilt in real time. Bentoncourt was next. He didn't struggle when Officer Voss instructed him to stand, but he moved with a stiff, reluctant stiffness, as if his limbs were fighting the humiliation spreading across his skin. The irony deepened when Voss retrieved the very handcuffs Benton had used as a weapon moments earlier. Benton's nostrils flared as the cuffs snapped shut around his wrists, loud enough for the nearest passengers to flinch. His shoulders hunched, and the redness in his ears betrayed a fury he could no longer act on. Under escort, he was guided to the back row, where he sat rigidly, staring forward with a hollow expression that flickered between disbelief and anger. Jamal remained still as this unfolded. His posture was tall, but controlled, the kind of strength that communicated precision, not chaos. In his hands, the lightweight tribunal tablet reflected the cabin lights in long, trembling lines. Officer Voss approached him with measured steps. "Dr. Redden," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of procedure, "you may file a formal charge to the Council of Flight Ethics. This will trigger a national-level review." Jamal didn't hesitate. He tapped the screen once, his fingertip firm yet composed, and the tablet emitted a soft confirmation tone. His expression remained neutral, but Kale, sitting beside him, felt the subtle shift, the quiet release of a man choosing principle over anger. Kale then rose, slowly so the bandage on his cheek wouldn't pull. The passengers quieted immediately. His voice was soft, unsteady at first, but carried sincerity that cut through the tension. "Thank you for standing with me," he said, his eyes scanning the faces of people who had been strangers barely an hour before. His throat tightened, but he continued. "Some of you didn't even know me, but you helped." The cabin absorbed his words like an emotional current. Heads bowed, shoulders eased. Even men seated rose away, leaned slightly forward as if trying to catch every syllable. Kale held his father's hand without looking at it, an instinctive gesture, steady and grounding. The tribunal officers closed their digital case folder, their movements precise and practiced. With a quiet tap on their screen, the Midair legal process officially ended. The sudden absence of procedural tension made the plane feel strangely heavier, like the atmosphere had thickened around everyone who had witnessed the transformation of fear into justice. Outside the cabin windows, Harvenport Field came into view, its illuminated runway casting long reflections across the aircraft's metal surface. The engines hummed at a lower pitch as the plane angled toward descent, taxiing onto the tarmac with slow, decisive movement. Inside, the passengers exchanged glances filled not with celebration, but respect. A few clasped their hands. Others blinked back, the lingering shock of realizing that they had participated in something unprecedented. When the landing gear touched down and the cabin jolted lightly. The quiet was broken by soft, tentative applause. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cheerful. It was reverent. Every clap carried the same understanding. They had witnessed something larger than fear, larger than conflict. They had watched a father protect his son with clarity and strength, watched truth take shape in real time, and watched a system bend toward accountability high above the earth. The applause built slowly, more men joining in, until the sound filled the cabin with a rare and humbling unity. Jamal looked toward Cale, whose shoulders relaxed for the first time since the strike. Their eyes met silently, father and son sharing a moment that neither would forget. The plane rolled toward a secure hangar, the runway lights streaking across the windows in soft golden lines, and the applause settled in a calm silence once more. What had begun as humiliation now landed as history. The moment the aircraft door sealed behind them, the sound of shouting reporters hit like a wave breaking against steel. Cameras were already lined outside the secured hangar, lenses flashing in rapid bursts, as though trying to tear through the tinted glass. News of the Midair tribunal had spread faster than the descent itself, carried by a passenger's live stream that millions had watched in real time. As Jamal stepped out, he instinctively positioned himself in front of Cale, shielding the boy with a steady, protective arm. Cale's bandaged cheek caught the glare of the floodlights, making the injury stand out even more sharply against his young face. Reporters surged forward despite the security cordon. "Dr. Redden, do you plan to press charges?" One called out, voice cracking with urgency. Another shouted, "Is Cale safe? What do you want the nation to know?" Jamal kept his expression firm, calm, but edged with exhaustion. The officer beside him gestured for space, but the shouting only grew louder until Jamal finally spoke. "My son's safety is not a courtroom strategy. It's a father's right," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The simple sentence made several reporters lower their microphones, taken aback by the grounded conviction in his tone. Cale looked up at him, eyes reflecting both trust and the sting of everything that had happened. Federal officers guided them toward a dark sedan waiting near the hangar wall. The metal structure echoed with every footstep as though amplifying the tension in the air. Once inside the vehicle, Cale leaned slightly against his father, not saying a word, and Jamal placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. The door shut, muting the outside storm, but not the weight they carried. As the car pulled away, Jamal glanced toward the hangar entrance. Through the briefly open gap, he saw Benton Core being escorted toward a separate processing station, wrists bound with the same handcuffs he had used to strike Cale. The captain followed behind, pale, shoulders slumped, eyes darting away from the cameras aimed at him. Jamal felt no satisfaction, only a quiet resolve. The vehicle drove them to a private rest suite within the Federal Transport Complex, where soft lighting and soundproof walls provided a rare moment of stillness. Cale sat on the edge of the cushioned seat, adjusting the bandage slightly as he watched his father pace. Jamal opened his phone and saw the temporary tribunal report already circulating online. Headlines flashed across the screen, each more intense than the last. A video clip auto-played. Cale's injury, the moment of the strike, Jamal standing in the aisle, calm and commanding. Another clip showed a passenger explaining what they witnessed. Below the videos, a flood of comments from millions of viewers expressed disbelief, anger, support. Jamal exhaled slowly. The incident was no longer contained to a flight. It had become a national conversation. Across the city of Norwin, the tech conference Cale had planned to attend had halted its schedule. The organizers released a public statement expressing solidarity and dedicated an entire segment to the unfolding event. When they reached out, asking if Cale wished to address the audience virtually, he hesitated. Then he nodded. "I want to," Cale said quietly, gripping the edge of the seat. His voice was steady, but Jamal recognized the tremor beneath it, not from fear, but from the weight of being seen by the world for something he never asked for. Minutes later, Cale stood before the small camera set up in the suite. A technician positioned a light, adjusting it until it softened the shadows on the bandage across his cheek. Jamal stepped back, allowing his son the space to speak for himself. When the screen connected to the conference hall, a hush fell over the crowd miles away. Cale drew a breath and lifted his chin. "I came here to share my ideas," he said, his voice clear despite everything. "I never thought the first one would be about justice." His words settled into the room like a quiet thunder. The technician lowered his head respectfully. Jamal felt a tightness in his chest, pride, sorrow, and something deeper he could not name. Cale stepped back once the recording ended, and father and son exchanged a silent, powerful look. Outside the suite, the world continued to react. Inside, the air felt still, as if holding its breath for what would come next. And with that, the cabin became a courtroom, and the courtroom became a nation. The fallout began the moment the wheels of Flight 403 touched the ground, spreading through the aviation industry faster than turbulence across an open sky. Within hours, headlines blazed across national networks, and by nightfall, every major outlet had replayed the Midair tribunal footage at least a dozen times. Jamal watched from the quiet of his home office, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting a long shadow across the room. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from officials, colleagues, strangers, but he ignored them all, his attention fixed solely on the formal notice that had just arrived from the Aviation Tribunal office. It confirmed the unprecedented nature of what had happened. A full legal proceeding completed Midair under the Emergency Passenger Protection Clause. Minutes later, another notification lit up his screen. This time, it was a commendation from the Federal Ethics Bureau. He opened the document carefully. The official language was sharp, respectful, and rare. Exceptional composure and constitutional execution of Clause A7.3. Jamal exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the tablet. It wasn't pride he felt, it was responsibility. A heavy one. He leaned back in his chair, letting the silence settle, when a new message suddenly appeared in an unmarked folder. The subject line was blank. The sender anonymous. Jamal hesitated for a moment before opening it, his instincts, honed by years of engineering assessments and risk evaluations, warning him that the most dangerous information often arrived quietly. Inside was a single statement. "You need to see this before they bury it." Attached beneath the note was a confidential internal document from Arison Airlines. Jamal clicked it open, and the room seemed to shrink around him. Lines of text scrolled quickly across the screen, complaints, reports, signatures, transfers. Each one formed a chain linking directly back to Bettencourt. There were 3 pending internal accusations against him: racially charged language, aggressive conduct, and misuse of restraint tools. Yet instead of being suspended or investigated, Benton had been transferred to Midair oversight with full authority privileges. A red-stamped notation stood out near the top of the page. Override authorization. Vernon Howrick Regional Safety Executive. Jamal's jaw tightened. He whispered the name under his breath. "So you knew," he murmured, leaning forward as the weight of the document's implications settled like heavy fog. His mind raced. If Howrick had overridden disciplinary action, then Benton's act wasn't a random outburst. It was part of a broader pattern. A pattern the company had allowed, maybe even encouraged, to hide. He read the document again, slower this time, noting every detail, every timestamp, every signature. His reflection stared back at him from the screen, steady, focused, but carrying a deeper tension. Cale's bandaged cheek flashed across his memory. The way the boy had looked up at him after the blow. Confused, hurt, trusting. A soft knock sounded at the door. It was Cale, standing there with a warm compress in his hand. "You okay, Dad?" he asked. His voice was gentle, but the curiosity beneath it was unmistakable. Jamal forced a small smile. "I'm all right," he said. "Just reading something important." Cale stepped closer, placing the compress onto his cheek. "Is it about the flight?" "Yes," Jamal answered. His tone was calm, but his mind was calculating, analyzing, preparing. "And it's something we need to handle carefully." Cale nodded slowly, sensing the gravity in his father's voice, then returned to his room. As the door clicked shut, Jamal turned back toward the screen. He knew what he had to do. Evidence like this couldn't sit in silence. It had to be pushed upward, outward, into the hands of those who couldn't ignore it. He opened a new message to Tribunal Officer Kale, the same officer who had presided over the Midair proceeding. His hands moved with purpose, typing only 7 words. This doesn't end at 38,000 feet. He attached the file, hit send, and watched the screen go dark. Outside his window, the night sky stretched wide and silent, but Jamal knew better. There were things hidden in the clouds, things people trusted blindly, things that needed light. He whispered into the stillness, steady and sure. The same words that now echoed in the message he had sent, the same words that would soon shake the foundations of an entire corporation. Because elevation can't hide what ethics bring down. The moment the tribunal doors opened, tension swept across the courtroom like a cold draft. Benton Core, the captain, and Vernon Howrick were already seated at the long respondent table, each separated by a small gap, as if even the furniture refused to let them appear united. Their expressions varied. Benton's jaw tightened with silent defiance, the captain's stare fixed on the floor, and Howrick's fingers tapping anxiously against his paperwork. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, whispering until the tribunal officer raised a hand for silence. Jamal and Kale entered together. The room shifted. Conversations died. Every eye followed the steady, quiet steps of the father and son who had turned a Midair assault into a national moment. Jamal's posture was measured and controlled, but Kale's presence struck the hardest, still bandaged, still young, but unmistakably composed. The boy walked with the quiet resolve of someone who had already faced more than he should have. "Please approach the witness stand," the presiding officer said, his voice firm but respectful. Kale stepped forward first. The microphone hissed softly as it adjusted to his height. He placed his hands together, breathing once, deeply before he began. "He came toward me slowly," Kale said, his voice even, steady. "I didn't say anything. I didn't stand. I just sat there." He crouched down and whispered something. Then, he struck me with the handcuffs. His eyes remained fixed on the tribunal panel, not on Benton. His tone was factual, not emotional, but the simplicity of his recounting weighed heavily on the room. It was the kind of truth that didn't need decoration. Benton shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his legal representative, but no one moved to interrupt. Kale continued, "I didn't understand why. I wasn't bothering anyone. I just wanted to practice for my presentation." Silence washed through the space. A man in the gallery exhaled shakily. Another closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of the words. When Kale stepped down, Jamal took his place. He rested one hand briefly on his son's shoulder, a silent assurance, before turning his attention to the tribunal. "I retrieved these documents from an anonymous whistleblower," Jamal said as he placed the folder onto the desk. His fingers hovered over its cover for half a second, as if acknowledging the gravity of what lay inside. They show that Benton Core was permitted to continue in Midair oversight despite multiple internal complaints. He opened the folder, revealing the printed files with highlighted passages and stamped signatures. The tribunal members leaned forward. "This," Jamal said, pointing to a signature on the second page, "is an override approval signed by Vernon Howrick. He authorized Benton to supervise flights even though he had pending complaints for misuse of restraint tools and discriminatory remarks." The room stirred. Howrick's lips parted as if he were searching for a denial, but none came. His eyes darted between the documents and the tribunal, panic slipping into his expression. One tribunal officer asked sharply, "Mr. Howrick, did you personally approve this override?" Howrick swallowed. "I had verbal clearance." "From whom?" the officer pressed. Howrick hesitated, his hands clenched together, knuckles whitening. "From a vice president," he admitted softly. "I was told to keep Benton in rotation until further notice." "Name," the officer said. Howrick inhaled shakily. "Darren Vex." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even Benton turned his head at that revelation, surprise flickering across his face. The captain sat rigid, realizing silently that the crisis had just widened beyond rogue behavior. It had become a chain of sanctioned silence. Jamal listened without shifting his expression. His restraint was deliberate, controlled. He waited until the murmurs faded before speaking again. This wasn't an accident, he said. This wasn't one man making a mistake in the air. This was an entire system making room for harm. He turned, for the first time, toward the cameras that lined the back wall, reporters, journalists, and observers capturing every word. If this company covered one handcuff, Jamal said steadily, how many others have been hidden? The room froze. The tribunal officers exchanged glances. The gallery remained utterly silent, absorbing the line with the weight of a verdict itself. And the chapter ended exactly where the original line demanded. Justice wasn't just descending, it was digging deeper. The statement from Harrison Airlines arrived only hours after the tribunal's ruling, but the damage had already surged far beyond corporate control. The moment the announcement went public, Harrison Airlines expresses regret and will suspend Benton Core and Vernon Howrick pending review. A wave of testimonies flooded every public channel. It started with a single video comment from a shaken teenager, then another, then dozens. By evening, it had become a storm of voices. Passengers from past flights stepped forward, each recounting moments that had once felt isolated but now clearly formed a disturbing pattern. Teenagers restrained with zip ties during minor disagreements. Fathers warned they would be removed if they questioned seat assignments. Mothers silenced with threats of security intervention. The air felt heavier each time a new story surfaced. It was as though the entire country had been holding its breath, waiting for someone else to speak first. Now, with proof of misconduct already exposed Midair, people were no longer willing to whisper about their experiences. They wanted answers and accountability. The breakthrough came from a former employee named Darvin Lorne, a quiet, sharp-eyed operations analyst who had worked in Harrison's oversight division for nearly 6 years. He arrived at the tribunal office with a single worn briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. When he sat down across from the investigators, his voice was steady, but his posture revealed tension, shoulders slightly raised, fingers tapping restlessly against the leather. "Understand the risks," he said, looking directly at the tribunal officers. "But people deserve to know." From the briefcase, he produced printed documents, handwritten notes, and internal memos. At the center of the pile was a spreadsheet labeled Behavioral Sensitivity Watch List. The paper trembled slightly in his hand as he passed it forward. "Regional managers created this," he explained quietly. "It was supposed to track passengers who showed disruptive tendencies. But the criteria weren't behavior, they were appearance, confidence level, and even perceived attitude. Many names on the list were young Black or Latino men." One investigator narrowed his eyes. "Who approved this?" Darvin swallowed hard. "Managers like Howrick, and supervisors who shared similar biases. It wasn't official policy, but it spread quietly. No one questioned it. The tribunal officers scanned each line carefully. Some names were tagged with red marks, the so-called high-risk passengers. Others had notes like "watch closely," "potential escalation," or "monitor interaction with crew." And there, near the bottom of the page, was a name written only hours before the incident. Cale Redden. The realization hit Jamal with a quiet, chilling weight when the document was shown to him. He stared at the paper, jaw set, the inked letters burning like a warning he hadn't known he needed to see. "They flagged a child," he said softly, voice controlled but resonating with disbelief. "They flagged my son for existing." As more details emerged, the tribunal moved swiftly. They gathered testimonials, cross-checked the names on the list, and pulled archived complaint files the airline had tried to bury. Every new discovery heightened the urgency. Each story echoed another, forming a chain of misconduct long overlooked. By noon, the tribunal issued its official ruling, a decision delivered with the tone of both justice and reckoning. Effective immediately, Midair restraint tools are banned for all non-security personnel, Officer Marincale announced, standing before a room crowded with press and citizens. Additionally, all physical contact incidents must be reported to federal oversight in real time. No exceptions. The words rippled through the nation like a turning tide. Later that evening, Cale stood before a school auditorium screen, delivering his conference speech virtually instead of in person. His cheek still held a faint mark beneath the medical tape, but his voice was calm and steady. His father sat just off-screen, watching with quiet pride and unspoken resolve. "I didn't think my first regional presentation would be about safety," Cale said, gripping the podium gently. "But sometimes your message changes when the world changes around you. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking to arrive with the same dignity we boarded with." The audience fell silent, not out of shock but understanding. His words had become more than a statement. They were a blueprint for change, carried from the clouds down to every classroom and community that heard them. And in those words, the bruises became blueprints. The applause had barely faded when Jamal noticed the way Cale's fingers trembled under the table, hidden beneath a stack of neatly arranged note cards. The panel on aviation ethics had drawn a full audience, the room filled with reporters, airline representatives, students, and advocates, all watching the 15-year-old boy whose quiet injury had reshaped national air safety rules. Cale didn't look out of place. He sat upright, shoulders relaxed, his expression calm. But Jamal saw the truth beneath the stillness. The memory of the handcuffs striking his cheek, the weight of speaking for others, the cost of carrying a story that shouldn't have been his burden. The moderator, a thin man with a soft voice, leaned forward. "Cale," he asked, "you've already inspired changes across the aviation sector. Why continue speaking about something so painful?" Cale's reply came quickly, without hesitation. "Because someone else might not have a father next to them." His voice was steady, but Jamal caught the faint quiver at the edges, less fear, more conviction. The room went silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. Jamal watched several attendees lower their eyes, shaken by the blunt truth delivered by someone so young. Outside the tall windows of the Norwin Civic Forum, aircraft glided across the sky, their silhouettes framed by late afternoon gold. Cale followed one with his eyes, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, something between caution and determination. Jamal placed a hand on his son's shoulder, steady and warm. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. A representative from the Passenger Dignity Coalition stood next, announcing the scholarship fund created in Cale's name. The news rippled through the crowd, drawing murmurs of approval. Cale looked overwhelmed for a moment, but he bowed his head politely. Jamal felt a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in Cale's resilience, sorrow that the recognition came from something that should never have happened. After the panel ended, media crews swarmed the hallway, but Jamal guided Cale through the crowd with practiced calm. Reporters called out, "Dr. Redden, do you believe the airline reforms go far enough?" "Cale, are you afraid to fly again?" Jamal answered none of them. His silence carried more authority than any statement could. As they exited through a quieter side corridor, a tribunal liaison approached them. "The final rulings have been confirmed," he said. His tone was formal, but his eyes held respect. Benton Corps is permanently banned from all flight operations. The captain's 5-year suspension has begun. Vernon Howrick resigned this morning during the internal review. Cale exhaled slowly. Jamal nodded, though his expression remained solemn. "Good," he said softly. But this was never just about punishment. The liaison understood and stepped aside. Jamal and Cale continued toward the terminal bridge that led to the main airport concourse. The space was bright, bustling, alive with travelers dragging bags, chatting, lining up at gates, ordinary scenes that felt strangely heavier now. Cale slowed near a window overlooking the departing aircraft. Jamal paused beside him, waiting. Rows of planes stood still, engines humming with distant promise. Cale pressed his palm lightly against the glass. The same side of his face that once carried a bandage now reflected faintly in the pain. The bruise had faded, but the memory had not. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't hesitant. He was thoughtful, quietly, deeply thoughtful. "Dad?" Cale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, son." Jamal turned to him. Cale didn't look away from the window. Instead, he spoke to the sky itself, voice steady, certain, and older than his years. He whispered, were boarding differently this time. Jamal felt the meaning settle in the air around them, an understanding that flying would never again be a simple trip, but a reminder of what they had survived and what they had changed. And for one brief moment, as a new plane taxied across the runway, the cabin lights from inside reflecting like stars on the glass, Cale's whisper seemed to echo with something deeper than memory, because the air remembers what happened in its silence. Within minutes of landing, officers boarded, statements were taken, and the courtroom erupted with the truth. The manager's aggression ended his career, while the father's precision and restraint reshaped the entire case. If you believe real authority uses preparation, clarity, and undeniable evidence to win, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of authority, and the power of accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, integrity, and the importance of standing up for justice.